I want to welcome you to the October 2nd message here at Meadowbrook Baptist Church called Abraham, or the Faith of Abraham, from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 16. We've been looking at living by faith as we've examined and read through Hebrews chapter 10, and now we're about halfway through Hebrews 11. On September 15, 2020, leaders from Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel gathered on the south lawn of the White House to sign an historic agreement known as the Abraham Accords. The longer title was the Abraham Accords Peace Agreement, Treaty of Peace, Diplomatic Relations, Full Normalization between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. There was actually a separate agreement with Bahrain called the Abraham Accords, Declaration of Peace, Cooperation, and Constructive Diplomatic and Friendly Relations between Israel and Bahrain. These agreements were historic. They were the first Middle East peace agreement since 1994. Over the next few months of 2020, into 2020, the Islamic nations of Sudan, Morocco, Oman, and Jordan all signed on to these historic Abraham Accords, as they were called. Now, can you imagine 4,000 years after you die, a group of world leaders gathering together to name these historic peace agreements in your name, the Abraham Accords? And that's exactly what happened. You see, the promises that God made to Abraham and the things that God did in Abraham's life still play a central role in our world today. Today we're going to be looking at the faith of Abraham and what happened in this life of this single individual named Abraham, and his faith make a difference today. Now, three major world faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all are referred to as Abrahamic faiths. Of course, the true faith is only through Christ, but also as it forerunner of that in Judaism. Now, adherents to these three Abrahamic faiths, get this, make up 55% of the world's population, or 4.4 billion people, which is amazing. One person having that kind of effect 4,000 years ago on over half of the world's population, Abraham. As we look at Abraham's faith this morning in the Hall of Fame of Faith chapter, Hebrews 11, we're going to see the impact of faith of one ordinary man whom God made an extraordinary promise to, that he was going to be the father of many nations, and through his offspring would bless the whole world. Through that one man, Abraham, his faith, God did impossible things. Amen. Here we see that God makes an extraordinary promise to Abraham, not when he was 15, not when he was 25 or 35 or 45, but when he was 75 years old. God comes to him and makes a promise. Now, in the last week, we looked at, in the first chapters of Genesis, people living to 900 years old. And you think 75 years old, well, that's still kind of young in that ballpark. But after the flood, we see that people's lives shortened quite a bit. Abraham lived to be 175 years old, which, man, that's still a long time, but still near to our lifespans. Now, the writer of Hebrews, as we have seen so far in this chapter, has been using examples to encourage the readers of his letter. mainly that were Jewish, not to shrink back from faith and go back to Judaism, but rather to hold on to their confidence. And he gives all these examples of faith. And he gave them a definition of faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not yet seen. And in verse 2, he says, this is what the ancients were commended for. And he begins giving these examples of faith. And yes, faith is challenging and life is challenging, but the promises of God are true. And like we saw in Abel and Enoch and Noah last week, today we're going to see in the life of Abraham that God's promises are fulfilled, and we are called in faith to obey. We see that in the Bible, a lot of attention is given to Abraham's faith. In fact, of the 50 chapters in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, chapters 11 through 25, or 14 chapters, deal with the life of Abraham and God's call upon Abraham, and Abraham putting his faith in God's promises. And even though some of the things seemed impossible, and even though he was called to make great sacrifices and a great journey, he trusted in God. Genesis 15:6 says he believed in God and it was credited to him as righteousness. And folks, when we believe God and have faith in God, don't shrink back like the rest of the world in fear, but hold on to our faith, we see that it changes our lives and that our confidence is rewarded, just as we're going to see with Abraham. Not only in the Old Testament book of Genesis, but we see that the rest of the Old Testament was all about Abraham's descendants. The rest of Genesis and Exodus, all the way through the end. It gives us the account of God's people and God's promises and how he worked in and through the people, descendants of Abraham, to bring about his promised deliverer. And then in the New Testament, we see it's a fulfillment of that Old Testament covenant or Testament promise. And we see it fulfilled in Jesus. And then in the New Testament, over and over again, we see a lot of attention is pointed back to point people to real faith. And the example is given of Abraham. And Jesus in John chapter 8, in dealing with his detractors, he talks about Abraham. And he tells them, Abraham looked forward to my day, which he did. Abraham had been made the promise, through your offspring, through your seed, the whole world's going to be blessed. And Jesus was the fulfillment of that promise. And they said, what? He said, you are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham. And Jesus responded, before Abraham was, what I am. The number one characteristic of Abraham was his extraordinary faith. And again and again, we see it talked about in the Old Testament. Stephen talked about God's promises to Abraham and his faith in Acts 7. Paul wrote whole chapters about Abraham's faith and how it is faith in God's promises, faith by God's grace through faith that you're saved. And in Romans chapter 4, he uses the example of Abraham. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And then Galatians 3 through 4, Paul uses Abraham's faith again. And then in James, you read about the saving faith and the example of Abraham. Now, as we look at Abraham's faith here in Hebrews 11, 8 through 16 today, we see that those who live by faith obey God while living as pilgrims in this world, putting their trust in God's eternal promises of a heavenly home. I want to read from Hebrews chapter 11 now, verses 1 through 6. Now, faith is the confidence of what we hope for. Oh, wait a minute. I got confused here. As verse 1. Verse 8 says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger living in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundation, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as countless as sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say these things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. At the end of Genesis 11, we find one of Noah's descendants, through Shem, his son. There was a man named Terah who lived in Ur of Chaldees. Just think like Baghdad, or Iraq, or Babylon. He had three sons, Nahor, Abram, and Haran. And it says that his son Haran died, and after that, Terah decided that he would move with his family, and including his sons Nahor and Abram and their wives and all of their possessions, to Canaan, the promise, which we know as the promised land. But they made it a few hundred miles on that journey. That was kind of the set direction that they had planned to go. But they only made a few hundred miles, and for whatever reason, Terah decides, let's stop here. And they set up a place, and they built a city there called Haran, Harran, after Terah's son Haran that had died. And they lived there a few years, and it says Terah died at the age of 205. Again, if you look at Genesis, you see it after the flood, slowly, or actually quite rapidly, and that the amount of the length of life began to shorten quickly. And after his dad died, Abram had an amazing experience. Now, we don't know, there in Ur of Chaldees, there's no record of people worshiping Yahweh or even Elohim. There was other gods, and most likely Abram grew up, he had never heard of the God, the God of the Bible. Nevertheless, God takes the initiative in our lives, and he comes to us just as he came to Abraham. And he came to Abram, calling him to a powerful promise. In Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and this is Abram at the age of 75 years old, it said, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went, as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. Now, our first verse here in our reading today, Hebrews 11, verse 8, says, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as an inheritance, obeyed and went, though he did not know where he was going. Can you imagine that? How many of you at the age of 75, and I'm 57 or 56 right now, how many of you, even at the age of 56, but particularly at the age of 75, you're well into retirement, and God comes to you and says, leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. At 75, you're saying, hey, I'm too old for that. We could come up with all kinds of excuses and questions, but it says immediately there in verse 4 that I read from Genesis 12, so Abraham went. Abraham obeyed, and it says not even knowing where he was going. You know, what would you do if God told you to get a moving truck, quit your job, sell your house, go to the land I will show you? Imagine Abraham's wife Sarah asking, "Where are we going, Abe?" And Abraham had said, "I don't know. God's just said God spoke to me and said He'll show me." And Abraham's faith was demonstrated by obedience. God spoke to him, and it says so he went. He didn't even know all the answers. And many times in life, folks. How many times are we looking, well, we have so many questions. Where are we going to live? How are we going to make it? Where am I going to work? All these questions. And there's a lot of unanswered questions. But when God calls us to go, we go. Abraham went, as the Lord told him. He got his wife and his cattle and belongings, and they start out on a several 100-mile journey. No GPS, no maps for him to look at, no travel guides, no person he could call on the phone. Can you tell me a little bit about Canaan? Nothing like that. Not knowing, he went. At the age of 32, a shoe cobbler named William Carey in England in 1793 felt God was calling him to leave England with his family, his wife, and he had 7 kids, and go to India. There was a mission society there in London. It had some support, but not, all these unanswered questions. How are we going to make it? But when you know God's calling you, you go. And Abraham, he had faith. And so he went, trusting God and his promises and not even knowing where he was going. And that's a hard thing for a man to admit, by the way. But we see once again, as defined there in verse 1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And my goodness, Abraham had not even seen Canaan before. Yet he was going with lock, stock, and barrel. And so faith is going where God leads you, even though you don't know all the answers, but you know that God is calling you and that he will guide and provide. Abraham took a journey of faith based on God's promises to a promised land he had never seen. And when Abraham got to Shechem, which is kind of on the eastern, maybe a little bit northeastern edge of the promised land, God said, all this land is yours. And God showed him, this land is going to be given to your offspring. And God, in Genesis 14 and 15 and 17 and later, God continued to remind and to say, this land is yours. I'm giving it to you as your inheritance. But get this, during Abraham's lifetime, he never owned property there, not until his wife Sarah died. He made his home, it says, in a promised land like a stranger in a foreign country, and lived as in tents as Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. He made his home And that word for made his home, it says that it literally says he lived outside of a house, making his home in tents. He lived as a stranger and as an alien. Folks, we have all kinds of, literally millions of people, some making their way all the way from Venezuela, coming up through South America and Colombia to through the Central American nations, across Mexico, all the way up here, looking for a new country. That's in itself a whole different ball of wax. But can you imagine traveling to a place you've never been before and then living as a stranger there? As Abraham had been promised, I'm going to make you a great nation, and yet he lived there as a stranger. And I think of those wagon trains, and I love watching Western movies, the Oregon Trail, and different stories like that. Talks of the Oregon Trail, which I think started in Kansas and went all the way through Nebraska, Wyoming, all the way to Oregon, was like 2,100 miles. It would take at least a good 3 months to travel by wagon. Could you imagine living in the wagon and setting up camp all the time? This was Abram's life till the time that he died, literally pulling up stakes as they grazed their flocks from place to place. And of course, God blessed them. And he even went shortly after he got to Canaan, they wound up going down to Egypt because there was a famine. Then they made their way back up to the Canaan. But living in a tent all that time, and the same thing was true for his sons, Isaac and Jacob, living in tents. Now, when I was growing up, our family went tent camping a lot. It was fun for a day or two, and go swimming and fishing. But this was their life. And of course, it became life for them. That was the way it was. But there was no place that they could really call their lasting home. Just from place to place, strangers and aliens. And yet God had made these promises, but of this land that would be theirs. And here they were almost living like outsiders in the land that would, as you read, later would become, after hundreds of years of Jacob's, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob's descendants were in Egypt for 400 years as slaves. Finally, after 40 years more wandering in the wilderness, they come to the promised land. But all that time, strangers and aliens, temporary residents, there's a song by Petra called Not of This World, which says, we are strangers, we are aliens, we're not of this world. That's us today, too. As the writer of Hebrews is making this point, these people, like Abraham and his sons, Isaac and Jacob after him, they had been given this promise of this was the promised land. Their descendants would inherit it and would enjoy this land flowing with milk and honey. But that whole time, they're living in tents. They had no city to call their own. But it says that Abraham looked forward to this city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. All this time, place to place, pulling up stakes. And they longed for a place where they could just call home and stay there, a place of security. Now, in our days, we think, boy, if we get them, maybe we'll have a big, nice ranch or something out in the country, a mansion or something. But in those days, these people lived out in the countryside all the time. In those days, the city represented a place of security, where there was walls that protected them. It represented a place of fellowship, a place of permanence, of belonging, and of being with other people. It's a place of storage as well, where goods were stored. And so when it says, for he was looking forward to a city whose architect and builder was God, uh, Abraham was even though he trusted God, he came to realize that there was more to it than just this earth. He was looking for a permanent city, a place in the very presence of God. And if you recall, really living by faith is living in God's presence. And Abraham's traveling around, these this 100 years after the promise is made, till he dies at the age of 175, and he comes to realize that what he was really looking forward to was living in the city of God, whose architect and builder is God. And being in fact, you see in Revelation, what's heaven pictured as this new city, this new Jerusalem coming down from heaven, where God is there, and there's no more death, no more dying, no more darkness, no more night. It's a land of eternal day. And so Abraham, while he did not know where he was going, he obeyed in faith and went, and he lived in this world as a pilgrim, as a traveling through, living in tents, but he longed for and he knew that, and was looking forward to that final place at the end of faith's journey that he looked and could see and knew was there, his hope he was certain of. Now he went, and it even mentions now there in verse 13 about not 13, verse 11. And by faith, even Sarah, who is past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promise. Even Sarah, not just Abraham, but Abraham's wife, was a woman of faith. And you might think, wow, um, you know, here she was 65 when the promise is first made, and God tells her husband, your wife's going to have a child. And here she is 65 years old. Now, I can't imagine, you know, even as a man becoming a father at the age of 75. Where would the energy come from? But, 65. And, I think the Guinness Book of World Records says that the oldest natural conception where with a successful delivery for a woman was at the age of 59. Now, here a couple years ago, they had a woman at the age of 74 through in vitro fertilization that gave birth to twin daughters in India. Can't imagine 74 years old giving birth, and but here, as we find out, Sarah would even beat that at the age of 90. But it says, even Sarah, by faith, Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promise. Oh, you think, well, didn't Sarah laugh when there in Genesis 18 when the three angels came and she was in the tent and she was overhearing the angels talking to Abraham, saying, a year from now, you're going to have a son. And she laughed. And you might think, how'd she have faith? Well, I encourage you, go and read Genesis 17:17, a chapter earlier, and God's saying, you're going to have a son when you're 100, and it says that Abraham fell face down and he laughed to himself, saying, will I be a father at 100 and my wife a mother at 90? You see, Abraham laughed too. It was impossible. Yet God had made them this promise and they believed. Now uh, they tried to help God out when Abraham was 86. It'd been 11 years, and And Sarah said, well, why don't you take my maidservant Hagar and sleep with her, and we'll fulfill God's promise that way. That wasn't God's plan, but they did it. And that's part of the problems we still have today. Ishmael, was born, and but God said that's not the child of promise. I said, your wife is going to have a son. And so at the age of 90, Sarah has Isaac. And she came to realize that even though she couldn't understand it, and it was unseen, how could this be possible? That the one who promised was faithful. You see, we put our trust in the Word of God. And yeah, Abraham laughed. I mean, let's be real here. Sarah laughed. I mean, this is impossible. And you get even to the New Testament there in Luke chapter 2, Zechariah, he's been praying for his wife who's barren, Elizabeth, to have a child. And he says, well, what? But they came to realize, Abraham and Sarah both, that the one who promised is faithful, and he'll do the impossible. He has the power to do the impossible. And it goes on to say, and so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as countless as the sand on the seashore. You see, those who have faith realize that God has the power to do the impossible in keeping his promises. And his most important promise is that he was going to bless the whole world through Abraham's offspring. And think of Abram. That's what his first name was. He was originally called there in Genesis 12, Abram, which means exalted father. People would come by and of course you're introducing yourself. Well, what's your name? Well, I'm Abram. I'm exalted father. Well, how many kids do you have? I don't have any kids. And you're called father? But then God said, when Abraham was 99, a year from now, you're going to have a son. It's through Sarah. And you are going to be called Abraham, father of many nations. You see, those who have faith can consider God who promised is faithful, and he has the power to do the impossible. When God says he will do it, he does it. If his word says it, he does it. And so from this man, it says he was as good as dead, 100 years old. He had a son. And his descendants became as numerous as sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. I Googled it the other day. Not that Google is the answer for as accurate answers, but I also had read it somewhere else. I was actually looking for a backup statistic that the other statistics said 380 million people that are living today are descended from Abraham. That's a lot. The Google answer said 400 million, but a lot of people, not just the Jewish people, but you take all these Islamic countries. You see, after Sarah died, he married again Keturah and had 6 sons by Keturah. Altogether, there's eight sons, including Isaac. And so you have literally his descendants are numerous, are very numerous. God kept his promise. He did the impossible. Abraham became the father of many nations. And then we get to this verse 13, kind of a summary about all these people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Sarah, and even those before them. All these people were still living by faith when they died. You think, well, will there ever come a time here during my lifetime here on earth where I don't need faith? No, we have faith. And, there's a land that is fairer than day, and by faith we can see it afar. For the Father waits over the way to prepare us a dwelling place there. Here on this side of life, the great divide, we have faith in God's promises. The promise of heaven, it's unseen. We don't see it yet, but we know that it's real. It says all these people were living by faith. When they died, they did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and even Jacob's 12 sons, they never lived to see the descendants of Abraham inherit and take possession of the promised land, which they did, as I said, 400 years of slavery down in Egypt, followed by 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and then finally they entered the promised land. But they saw these, and they continued to believe, and they welcomed them. It says they only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. Again, the unseen. They lived in tents as strangers and aliens, and they did not receive the promised land. It was only, when Sarah died, Abraham bought a field from a Hittite down near Hebron. At the end of the field was a cave, and he bought that field as a burial ground, and the cave particularly as a burial plot, as a tomb for his wife Sarah. That's all he owned. Just a gravesite. Yet he believed and knew that God was faithful, but more than that, not only to give him his descendants that promised land, but he began to understand there was something more, a greater promised land. In about a year, hallelujah, my wife and I are going to have our property here in Auburn paid off. Woohoo! I've mentioned this before. But you know what? When I die, will that property belong to me? No. Somebody else will receive it. They'll take my remains and they'll plant them 6 feet under some cemetery somewhere. You see, this world is kind of like Alfred Brumley wrote back in 1936. This gospel music writer said, "This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue." This isn't it. This is not the final destination. Faith has a final destination. It's not here on earth. It's with the Lord in heaven. Faith is fulfilled when ultimately we live in the very presence of God. Faith, living by faith, is living in God's presence and knowing that He meets our every need. These people in faith, they looked forward they welcomed the promise, knew it would be fulfilled, the promised land here on earth. But these people were looking for a much greater country. By faith, they admitted they were only strangers and foreigners on this planet. They were looking for a better country, and this country, word for country, means father's country or father's land. Not talking about Abraham's land or Isaac or Jacob, but the Heavenly Father's land. They said if these people were talking about the country they were going back to, like Ur of the Chaldees for Abraham, they would have went back there. But no, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly country. Abraham was called to a journey of faith, wasn't he? And he didn't shrink back. He obediently went. He wasn't planning on going back to Ur of the Chaldees. He knew that God was calling him to go with him. In obedience, God spoke. Abraham obeyed, not knowing where he was going. He knew God and had a plan to bless the whole world through his offspring, even though he didn't have any kids. And he went, and he lived his whole life in a tent, but yet he knew that there was a city waiting for him. In faith, he looked forward to that city. And the further he went along, he realized that his destination was the city of God, and that God had prepared a place for him. The very last verse, 16, says, "Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." Faith finds its ultimate destination, living in the very presence of God. Amen. In the Bible, it refers to God often, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, Jesus, I think it was Luke 20. Also, it's in Matthew, but they were his detractors were the Sadducees particularly did not believe in the resurrection. They gave him this outlandish idea, this outlandish example. What if there's a man who died and has left his wife a widow without kids, and his brother, he has 7 brothers, and they each marry him, and they asked Jesus, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? And Jesus said, you're mistaken. In heaven, there's no marriage or given in marriage. And he goes on to tell them, you don't understand the scriptures where it refers to God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but the living. And, when my girls were in school over here at Auburn, often, I began to be called, "Oh, you're Sarah's father, or you're Rachel's dad, or you're Rebecca's dad." And I began to, I still cherish that title. I'm their father. Here it says that those who put their faith in God, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. And God in heaven says, yes, I'm Abraham's God. Or yes, I'm Isaac's God. Or yes, I'm Jacob's God, and I have a city for them. And when they get there, he welcomes them on in. Faith, living by faith, is looking forward to living in the very presence of God and living with him. And he says, welcome home. Welcome home. Back in September of 1620, William Bradford joined 101 other people aboard the Mayflower, and they took a 2-month journey over here to the New World. They were literally pilgrims, weren't they? They were looking for their promised land. And many of them were Christians, not all of them. But William Bradford, who became, I think, the second governor of Plymouth Plantation, Plymouth Colony, he wrote in a book called A Plymouth Plantation. He compared the pilgrims that came across the Mayflower to these people in Hebrews 11. And he wrote, they knew, talking about he and the others, they knew they were pilgrims, and they looked not much on those things, but lifted up their eyes, talking about all the struggles they went through in Plymouth Plantation, but lifted up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. The pilgrims crossed over on the Mayflower, and what William Bradford was saying, much like these people, they realized that the real New World wasn't in Massachusetts Bay Colony, but was in heaven. And all the struggles you go through in this life, and there are many, we are called simply to follow the Lord wherever he leads us. And we're just temporary, this life, this world is not my home. Certainly, there's a lot of things we enjoy here on earth, and our kids and different things. But this world's not our home. We are looking forward to a city whose architect and builder is God. And it's not Auburn, it's not Springfield, it's not any city here on earth. It's a place, Jesus said, I go and in my Father's house there are many rooms. I go and prepare a place for you. And if that were not so, I would have told you, but I'm coming back. And he said, I am the way, the truth, and life. Faith, the journey of life, is knowing that God has promises for you. And that you say, God, wherever you lead me, I'll go. And the further you go along on this journey, you realize that he's taking you to a new country, a heavenly city. And not only is he with you here on earth, but he's got great plans for you. Have you trusted in Jesus as your Lord and Savior? Do you know where your destination is? Are you on your way to the city of God, where he says, I'm David's God. I'm so glad you're home. I'm glad you call me your God. Welcome home.